Welcome to Wondrous session. In this deep dive, we find ourselves in the icy Kashmir Valley, well, both literally and metaphorically. We're going to be exploring the turbulent history of terrorism in this region.
A story woven with threads of identity, governance, and the human cost of conflict.
Exactly. It's a region of breathtaking beauty. But as you know, its story is far from peaceful.
To truly grasp the rise of terrorism in Kashmir, we need to look beyond the headlines and delve into the sociological forces at play.
Absolutely. And we've got this fascinating research paper right here.
Rising Terrorism in Kashmir Valley Following Coalition Union Government.
It digs into that very connection, exploring the impact of shifting political landscapes.
Particularly the role of coalition governments on the escalation of violence.
So it's not just a dry history lesson.
It uses sociology to examine the conflict's roots, drawing on thinkers like Emil Durkheim and Max Weber.
Okay, so let's unpack this. You're in Kashmir. Why has this place been so prone to conflict? What makes it vulnerable?
Well, imagine a wound that never fully heals, constantly being reopened.
Oof, that's a powerful image.
That's the legacy of the 1947 partition of India. It left Kashmir's ownership disputed between India and Pakistan, creating this constant tension right from the start.
So it's like this tug of war with Kashmir stuck in the middle.
Exactly. And then you layer on internal issues within Indian-administered Kashmir, poor governance, lack of development, creating discontent among the people.
It's almost like a recipe for disaster, right?
Yeah.
You have pressure from Pakistan, and then you have these internal vulnerabilities that make the region ripe for exploitation.
Right. And Pakistan was strategic with their involvement. They had a plan called Operation Tupac, which focused on exploiting those tensions.
It was deliberate.
Think of it like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Wow.
They channeled weapons from the Soviet-Afghan war into the region and played on religious differences to stir things up even more.
So Pakistan wasn't just claiming territory, they were actively trying to destabilize the region.
Absolutely. And this research paper argues that this interference wouldn't have been as effective if those internal issues weren't already simmering.
That makes sense. Now, this research paper includes a stark timeline of terrorist attacks in the region, and it's heartbreaking. It's a real reminder of the human cost of this conflict.
It is. The timeline starts with the exodus of Kashmiri Hindus in 1990. Imagine being forced from your home simply because of your religion.
It's unimaginable.
It shattered the social fabric of the region, leading to hundreds of documented deaths.
It's a wound that runs deep. And then throughout the 90s and early 2000s, we see this pattern of horrific violence, like the Chepnari Prinkot and Wandama massacres. These were attacks aimed at specific communities, at religious pilgrims.
It's a horrific pattern aimed at creating fear and division.
And think about the impact on the Kashmiri people, living with this constant threat of violence.
It's terrifying. And these attacks didn't stop. In the 2000s, there were attacks on government buildings, civilian buses.
Like the Kaluchak bus attack, which killed 31 people.
Each attack further fractured social trust, deepened those divides, and made violence a terrifying part of daily life.
It's especially tragic for the young people who grew up surrounded by it.
It's like a cycle of trauma, where violence begets more violence.
You're right, but this research paper doesn't just lay out a timeline. It goes deeper, using sociological theories to try to understand the root causes of this violence.
So that's where things get really interesting. One of the theories they use is Emil Durkheim's theory of enemy.
Could you break that down for our listener? I know it's a complex idea.
Think of it like this. Imagine a society where the rules of the game have vanished.
Okay.
People don't know who to trust, what's right or wrong. There's a breakdown in social norms, and suddenly violence seems like the only way to get ahead. That's enemy.
So in Kashmir, you're saying this weak governance created this anomic state where extremist groups could thrive.
Exactly. It's like a vacuum being created, and nature abhors a vacuum. So in this case, extremist groups rush in to fill that void.
It makes you wonder, if the government had been stronger, more legitimate, could this have been prevented?
That's a big question, and that's where Max Weber's ideas about legitimacy and bureaucracy come in. He argued that a state derives its power from its legitimacy in the eyes of the people. When the government is seen as corrupt or ineffective, it loses that legitimacy. People are less likely to obey its laws.
So in Kashmir, you're saying this lack of legitimacy, along with the breakdown of government structures, created an environment where these militant groups could gain power.
Exactly. It's like the foundation of the house is crumbled, and now anyone can come in and take over.
It's sobering to think that the very institutions meant to protect us can sometimes become part of the problem.
It's a complex issue for sure. But this paper highlights that you can't understand the rise of terrorism in Kashmir without understanding these deeper sociological forces at play.
It's not just about bombs and bullets.
It's about the breakdown of social order and the erosion of trust in institutions.
Now, it's easy to get lost in the specifics of Kashmir, but the paper also encourages us to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. It draws some parallels to other global conflicts, like the Troubles in Northern Ireland and the Civil War in Colombia.
The point of those comparisons is to see if there are any lessons we can learn.
Any strategies for conflict resolution that might be applicable to Kashmir.
Right.
So let's start with Northern Ireland. What was that conflict all about, and are there any takeaways that we could apply here?
Well, the Northern Ireland conflict was a brutal, decades-long struggle. On one side, you had Protestant Unionists who wanted to stay part of the United Kingdom, and on the other, you had Catholic nationalists who wanted to join a united Ireland. It involved paramilitary groups on both sides, as well as the British Army.
That sounds a bit like the religious and political divisions we see in Kashmir.
There are definitely similarities, but what's important is that they eventually reached a peace agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, in 1998.
Okay.
And that agreement offers some key insights for other conflict zones.
What were some of the key elements of that agreement? I'm sure our listener would be interested in that.
Well, first and foremost, it recognized the need for inclusive dialogue. All parties to the conflict, including those paramilitary groups, were brought to the negotiating table.
So it wasn't just about governments talking to each other. It was about bringing everyone with a stake in the conflict into the conversation.
Exactly, and that was crucial for building trust and finding common ground. The agreement also emphasized power sharing. It created a new government for Northern Ireland based on the principle of power sharing between unionists and nationalists.
Interesting. So it wasn't about one side winning over the other. It was about finding a way for both sides to share power and control.
Right. It's about compromise and understanding that you can't just erase the other side.
Makes sense.
And finally, the Good Friday Agreement emphasized truth and reconciliation. It established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate past atrocities and help communities heal from the trauma of the conflict.
Okay, so let's apply those lessons to Kashmir. What would that look like?
Well, it would require a willingness from all sides to engage in meaningful dialogue, even with groups that have been labeled as terrorists.
That's a big step.
It would also mean exploring options for power sharing within the region.
Perhaps by granting greater autonomy to Kashmir.
You got it.
And I imagine it would require some sort of truth and reconciliation process to address past hurts and build a shared future.
You're exactly right. It's a tall order, but I think the Northern Ireland example shows that it's possible to move from a state of intractable conflict to one of lasting peace if there's a genuine commitment to those principles.
Now, what about Colombia? What can we learn from their experience?
The Colombian conflict was a bit different. It was primarily a civil war between the government and leftist guerrilla groups like the FARC. But like Kashmir, it was a protracted conflict with a high human cost. And they also eventually achieved a peace agreement in 2016.
Okay. What were some of the key takeaways from that process?
One thing that stands out is that the Colombian peace process focused heavily on addressing the root causes of the conflict, particularly the issue of rural inequality and land ownership.
So they recognized that economic inequality often fuels conflict, and they made an effort to address that.
Exactly. They implemented land reform policies, invested in rural development, and created programs to help former combatants reintegrate into society.
It sounds like a very holistic approach, recognizing that peace isn't just about silencing the guns.
It's about creating the conditions for lasting stability and prosperity.
That's exactly it. And that's a crucial lesson for Kashmir as well, where issues of economic inequality and political disenfranchisement are major drivers of the conflict. Now, we've talked about these other conflicts, but let's bring it back to Kashmir. Is there a way out of this cycle of violence? Does this research paper offer any solutions?
It does. And the solutions it proposes are informed by the lessons learned from those other conflicts we just talked about. It suggests a multi-pronged approach, focusing on political solutions, economic development, and counterterrorism efforts.
Okay, let's break that down for our listener. What would those solutions look like in practice?
Well, on the political front, the paper emphasizes the need for greater autonomy for the region. It suggests exploring options for power sharing, giving Kashmiris more control over their own affairs.
Okay.
That's similar to what worked in Colombia.
What about economic development? What does the paper suggest?
The paper argues that investing heavily in education and infrastructure is essential for creating opportunities and reducing the appeal of joining militant groups. It also suggests exploring ways to promote cross-border trade and cooperation.
So if you give people hope for a better future, they're less likely to turn to violence.
Exactly. Now, the paper doesn't shy away from the very real need for counterterrorism efforts.
Right. You can't ignore the fact that there are groups actively engaged in violence and terrorism. But, as we talked about before, it's about finding that right balance.
How do you target those groups without alienating the entire population and making the problem worse?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
The paper suggests that India's counterterrorism strategy needs to evolve, becoming more sophisticated and targeted.
What do you mean by that? Can you give our listener an example?
Well, it's about moving beyond just brute force and thinking more strategically. For example, the paper talks about disrupting the financial networks that support terrorist groups, going after their enablers, their funding sources.
So cutting off the head of the snake.
Precisely. It also highlights the need to counter the spread of extremist ideologies online, especially on social media, which is often used for recruitment and propaganda.
So it's a multifaceted approach. You have to address the immediate threat of violence. But you also have to target the underlying systems that are fueling that violence.
Exactly. And the paper suggests this requires international cooperation.
India can't do it alone.
They need to work with other countries to track down terrorist financing, share intelligence, and put pressure on states that are supporting these groups.
Speaking of other countries, this paper specifically calls out Pakistan for its continued support of proxy warfare in Kashmir.
It does, and it argues that India needs to work with international allies to put pressure on Pakistan to dismantle the terrorist infrastructure within its borders.
Do they make any specific suggestions for how to do that?
They even suggest launching campaigns to label Pakistan as a state sponsor of terrorism, which could have serious diplomatic consequences.
That's a bold move. But this paper seems to be saying that the time for tiptoeing around this issue is over. If you want to achieve lasting peace in Kashmir, you have to address that elephant in the room.
Right. You can't just sweep it under the rug and hope it goes away.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the role of coalition governments in all of this. The paper argues that coalition governments can actually be an asset in finding a peaceful resolution to the Kashmir conflict.
Yes, it might seem counterintuitive at first. You might think that having multiple parties with conflicting agendas would make it harder to reach a consensus.
That's what I was thinking. Too many cooks in the kitchen and all that.
But the paper argues that coalition governments can actually foster a more unified national approach to the issue.
How so?
Well, it forces different political parties to work together. It creates a sense of shared responsibility for finding a solution.
Okay.
It's like what we discussed earlier about moving beyond narrow partisan interests and working towards a common goal.
So instead of each party trying to score political points by taking a hardline stance, they're incentivized to find a solution that works for everyone.
Precisely. And the paper even suggests that coalition governments might be more open to engaging in dialogue with a wider range of Kashmiri stakeholders, including groups that have previously been considered off-limits.
Because they have to build consensus within their own coalition.
They might be more willing to compromise and find creative solutions.
I see.
And finally, the paper highlights that coalition governments are often more representative of the diversity of India's population.
So they're more likely to take into account the perspectives and needs of different ethnic and religious groups.
Right. And that's particularly important in a case like Kashmir, where religious and cultural identities play such a significant role in the conflict.
This paper has really painted a rich and nuanced picture of the Kashmir conflict. It's clear that there are no easy solutions, but by applying lessons learned from other conflict zones and thinking creatively, there's at least a glimmer of hope.
I agree. And I think the paper's emphasis on drawing parallels to the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland and the peace process in Colombia is particularly valuable. It reminds us that even seemingly intractable conflicts can be resolved if there's a genuine commitment to peace from all sides.
And the paper's focus on the sociological aspects of the conflict, those underlying issues of identity, governance, and social trust, is so important. It's a reminder that you can't just address the violence without addressing those deeper issues that are fueling it.
It's a call for a more humane and holistic approach to peace building.
One that recognizes the complexities of the situation and the need to address both the immediate security concerns and the long-term needs of the Kashmiri people.
Absolutely.
We've talked about potential solutions outlined in the paper, but there's one final piece I want to touch on. The idea of international cooperation.
Right. The paper emphasizes that India can't solve this problem alone. They need the support of the international community, particularly in terms of putting pressure on Pakistan to end its support for terrorist groups. But it goes beyond that.
What else do they suggest?
Well, it suggests that India should leverage existing frameworks for regional cooperation, like the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SARC,
Can you tell our listener why that's important?
because it creates a platform for dialogue and cooperation on issues of mutual interest. And this paper argues that it could be a way to build trust and reduce tensions between India and Pakistan.
So it's not just about isolating Pakistan. It's about finding ways to work together on issues that benefit both countries.
Exactly. And the paper even suggests exploring joint initiatives in areas like hydropower, agriculture, and trade. It's about creating a sense of interdependence where both countries have a stake in each other's success.
It's a long-term vision, but it's a hopeful one. Imagine a future where India and Pakistan are working together to solve regional problems instead of fighting over them. It would be a game changer for the entire region, not just for Kashmir.
Now, the paper acknowledges that achieving that level of cooperation is a tall order, given the history between India and Pakistan.
Yeah, it's not going to be easy.
But it argues that it's not impossible, and the potential rewards are so great that it's worth striving for.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but I have one question that's been on my mind throughout this whole deep dive. The paper lays out the historical context, the sociological factors, potential solutions, but what's missing is the voice of the Kashmiri people themselves.
You're absolutely right. This research paper, being primarily a historical and sociological analysis, focuses on external perspectives and theories. It doesn't go into the lived experiences of ordinary Kashmiris.
Exactly. And I think it's essential for our listener to remember that this conflict isn't just some abstract geopolitical chess game. It's about real people, real lives being impacted by the violence and instability.
Absolutely. To truly understand the complexities of this issue, we need to hear from the people who are living it. We need to hear their stories, their hopes, their fears, their visions for the future.
We need to move beyond the theories and the political pronouncements and get a sense of what life is actually like for people on the ground in Kashmir.
You know, this brings up an interesting point. We've explored the history, the theories, the potential solutions, but what are you taking away from all of this?
What stands out to you?
And even more importantly, what questions are you left with?
What aspects of this conflict are you curious to learn more about? Whose voices do you want to hear? Whose stories do you want to learn about?
Before we shift our focus, I think it's important to remember that we've only scratched the surface of this complex issue.
Yeah.
There are so many layers to unpack, so many different perspectives to consider.
You're absolutely right. We've laid out some of the historical and sociological context, but now I want to dig deeper into those potential solutions that the research paper outlines. You mentioned a multi-pronged approach.
Focusing on political solutions, economic development, and promoting socio-political inclusion.
Yes, and I think it's crucial to explore each of these in detail because they're interconnected, right?
You can't address one without considering the others. They're like threads in a tapestry, each one contributing to the overall picture.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So let's start with those political solutions. What stands out to you from the paper's recommendations? What should our listener be paying attention to?
Well, one key idea is granting greater autonomy to the region.
Okay.
It's about giving Kashmiris more control over their own affairs, their own destiny.
It makes sense.
Think of it like this. If you feel like you have no voice, no say in how your life is governed, you're more likely to feel frustrated, even resentful.
And that resentment can fester.
Right. Leading to anger and even violence. It's like that old saying, give me liberty or give me death.
Exactly. People want to feel agency, like they can shape their own future. And that's where autonomy comes in.
It's about recognizing the unique identity and aspirations of the Kashmiri people.
So how would that look in practice? What are we talking about here?
Well, it could involve things like devolving more power to local governing bodies, allowing them to make decisions on issues that directly affect their communities. It could also involve constitutional reforms that recognize the special status of Kashmir within the Indian Union.
It's about finding that balance between being part of a larger nation,
while still retaining a sense of identity and self-determination.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this isn't just some abstract theory. The research paper actually cites specific scholars who advocate for restoring political agency to Kashmir as a crucial step toward lasting peace.
It's not just a pie-in-the-sky idea. There are experts who believe this could actually work.
Right.
And it makes sense when you think about those parallels we drew to Northern Ireland. The power-sharing model there, where both unionists and nationalists had a role in government, was a key factor in ending the conflict.
It's like that saying, if you want peace, work for justice. It's about addressing the underlying political grievances that fuel the conflict.
Exactly. And speaking of Northern Ireland, remember how important dialogue was in that peace process? This research paper emphasizes the need for India to engage with all Kashmiri stakeholders, including those separatist groups that have often been demonized.
Now, that's a bold suggestion. Talking to groups that you've labeled as terrorists, it seems like a risky move.
It is risky, but think about it this way. If you want to end a conflict, you have to talk to the people you're fighting with. You have to understand their perspective, their grievances.
It's like that quote from Nelson Mandela, if you want to make peace with your enemy, you have to work with your enemy. Then he becomes your partner.
Exactly. And it's not about condoning violence or giving in to demands. It's about recognizing that these groups represent a segment of the Kashmiri population and their voices need to be heard. It's about creating a space for dialogue, for understanding, for finding common ground.
But let's be realistic. Years of conflict, of bloodshed and mistrust have created deep divisions. It's going to be incredibly difficult to build that trust, to get those different groups to sit down at the same table and talk.
Absolutely. It's going to be a long and difficult process.
For sure.
It will require patience, empathy, a willingness to compromise. But I think the alternative, continuing this cycle of violence and retribution, is even more terrifying.
Yeah. It's a gamble, for sure, but one that might be worth taking. And this brings up another important point. The paper argues that purely political solutions aren't enough. They need to be coupled with economic development. It's about addressing the root causes of the conflict, the poverty, the lack of opportunity that often drive young people into the arms of extremist groups.
Think about it. If you're a young person in Kashmir and you see no hope for the future, no way to improve your life, it's easier to get swept up in the promises of these radical groups.
It's like that old saying, idle hands are the devil's workshop.
Exactly. And that's why the paper emphasizes the importance of investing in education and infrastructure. It's about creating jobs, opportunities, a sense of hope for the future. It's about giving young people a stake in society, a reason to believe in a peaceful and prosperous future.
So it's not just about building schools and roads. It's about investing in the human capital of Kashmir.
Absolutely. It's about empowering people, giving them the tools they need to build a better life for themselves and their families. And the paper also talks about the importance of promoting entrepreneurship, of fostering a culture of innovation and creativity. It's about recognizing that Kashmir has so much potential, so much to offer the world.
And imagine if that potential could be unlocked, if Kashmir could become a hub for trade and commerce, a center for technology and innovation. It could transform the entire region.
It could. And the research paper suggests some concrete ways to achieve that. It talks about leveraging existing frameworks like the South Asian Free Trade Agreement to facilitate cross-border trade.
That's interesting. So it's not just about India investing in Kashmir. It's about creating opportunities for regional cooperation, for economic integration.
Right. And think about the ripple effects of that. If Kashmir becomes a thriving economic center, it could create jobs and opportunities not just for Kashmiris, but for people in neighboring regions as well. It could create a vested interest in peace and stability. It could become a model for how to overcome conflict through economic cooperation.
That's a powerful vision, and one that I think resonates with that idea of interconnectedness we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
You can't separate the political from the economic.
They're intertwined, and they both need to be addressed if you want to achieve lasting peace.
Exactly. And that brings us to the third element of this multi-pronged approach, socio-political inclusion. Now, this one is a bit more nuanced, but I think it's equally important. It's about addressing that sense of alienation that many Kashmiris feel, that feeling of being excluded from the political and economic mainstream.
Right. It's about addressing the psychological and emotional wounds that have been inflicted by years of conflict and oppression. It's about creating a society where everyone feels valued, respected, and included, regardless of their religion, ethnicity, or political beliefs.
It sounds like a very tall order, especially in a place like Kashmir, where there are such deep divisions, such long-standing grievances.
It is a challenging task, no doubt about it, but I think it's essential. If you want to build a truly peaceful and just society, you have to address those underlying feelings of resentment and marginalization.
So how do you do that? What concrete steps can be taken to promote this socio-political inclusion?
Well, the paper suggests a combination of approaches. First, it emphasizes the importance of confidence-building measures. Things like promoting cultural exchanges, easing travel restrictions, encouraging people-to-people contact between the Indian and Pakistani-administered sides of Kashmir. It's about breaking down those barriers, those walls of mistrust that have been built up over the years.
It's about reminding people that they have shared humanity, shared interests, that they're not so different after all.
Exactly. And beyond those immediate measures, the paper also talks about the need to address deeper issues of human rights and social justice. It mentions strengthening civil society institutions, creating platforms for youth engagement, giving young people a voice and shaping their own future.
So it's about empowering people, especially those who have been marginalized, to participate in the political and social life of their communities.
Exactly. And it's about holding those in power accountable for their actions. It's about creating a system where everyone feels like they have a stake in the game, that their voices matter.
The paper also talks about countering the narrative that often paints India as an oppressor of Islam in Kashmir. How would they go about doing that?
The research suggests that India should be more proactive in highlighting the region's history of religious pluralism and its rich Sufi traditions. It's about reclaiming the narrative, countering extremism with a more inclusive and tolerant vision of Kashmir.
It's about showcasing the beauty and diversity of Kashmiri culture, reminding people that it's a place where different religions and traditions have coexisted for centuries.
Exactly. It's about challenging those stereotypes and prejudices that have fueled the conflict for so long. It's about promoting a vision of Kashmir that's rooted in peace, harmony, and mutual respect.
We've talked a lot about these more holistic approaches, but we can't ignore the fact that there were groups actively engaged in violence and terrorism. The paper acknowledges the very real need for counterterrorism efforts. But how do you do that effectively without alienating the entire population and making the problem worse? It's a delicate balance.
It is. The paper suggests that India's counterterrorism strategy needs to evolve. It needs to become more sophisticated, more targeted, more focused on intelligence gathering and surgical strikes rather than blunt force.
Can you give our listener an example of what that might look like?
Well, instead of just conducting mass arrests and raids that can alienate entire communities, they could focus on identifying and disrupting the financial networks that support terrorist groups. They could go after their leaders, their recruiters, their sources of funding.
So it's about being smarter, more strategic, more precise in their approach.
Right. And the paper also emphasizes the importance of winning hearts and minds. It's about addressing those underlying grievances that drive people to extremism, about creating opportunities for young people, about promoting a sense of hope and belonging.
So it's not just about fighting terrorists, it's about fighting the ideology that fuels terrorism.
Exactly. And that's a much more complex and challenging task. It requires a long-term commitment, a willingness to engage with communities, to build trust, to address those root causes of the conflict.
The paper also highlights the need for international cooperation. India can't do this alone. It needs the help of other countries.
That's right. The paper specifically calls out Pakistan for its continued support of proxy warfare in Kashmir and argues that India needs to work with international allies to exert pressure on Pakistan to stop this. It even suggests launching campaigns to label Pakistan as a state sponsor of terrorism.
Now, that's a controversial move, but the paper seems to be saying that if you want to achieve peace in Kashmir, you have to address the elephant in the room. You have to confront those actors who are actively fueling the conflict.
And the paper also suggests that India should engage with other countries in the region, like China, which also has a stake in the stability of Kashmir. It's about finding common ground, building alliances, working together to create a more secure and prosperous future for the region.
Now, earlier we discussed the role of coalition governments in finding a peaceful resolution to the Kashmir conflict. It might seem counterintuitive that having multiple parties with potentially conflicting agendas would make things easier.
It does seem counterintuitive on the surface, but the paper argues that coalition governments can actually be an asset in this situation.
Can you remind our listener why they think that is?
Because it forces those different parties to find common ground, to work together toward a shared goal. It can create a more unified and consistent national approach to the issue.
So instead of each party trying to score political points by taking a hardline stance, they have to cooperate and find solutions that work for everyone.
Exactly. And the paper suggests that this can be particularly helpful in a complex and sensitive issue like Kashmir, where there are so many different stakeholders and perspectives involved.
Now, throughout this whole deep dive, we've been talking about this research paper, which is fascinating, but it focuses on a very specific aspect of the conflict, the role of coalition governments.
And it primarily draws on historical analysis and sociological theories.
What it doesn't capture is the human element of this conflict.
You're absolutely right. The paper provides a valuable framework for understanding the political and social dynamics of the conflict. But it doesn't delve into the lived experiences of ordinary Kashmiris, the people whose lives have been directly impacted by this violence.
And those are the stories that we need to hear. Those are the voices that need to be amplified.
Exactly. We need to move beyond the abstract theories and the political pronouncements and get a sense of what life is actually like for people on the ground in Kashmir. What are their hopes and fears? How has this conflict shaped their lives, their families, their communities?
It's like that saying, walk a mile in another man's shoes. We need to try to understand this conflict from the perspective of the people who are living it every day.
And that brings us to a crucial question for our listener. What are you curious about? We've laid out some of the key issues, but there are so many more layers to this conflict. What aspects of this story do you want to explore further?
What questions do you have? Whose voices are you interested in hearing? Whose stories do you want to learn about? And whose stories do you want to learn about? I mean, we've spent so much time talking about the big picture, the history, the politics, the theories.
But at its heart, this conflict is about people.
Real people with real lives who are just caught in the crossfire of this decades-long struggle.
And their voices are often lost in the noise of the conflict.
Yeah, you hear from politicians, experts, international organizations.
But how often do you hear from the people who are actually living this reality? Every single day.
Not nearly enough. And it's something that we really wanted to emphasize in this deep dive.
Think about it for a moment.
Yeah.
Every statistic we've discussed, every date on that timeline of attacks.
It's heavy stuff.
It represents a life shattered, a family torn apart, a community grappling with unimaginable pain.
And each one of those stories deserves to be heard. We can't just look at numbers on a page. We have to remember the human cost of this conflict.
Take, for example, the Kashmiri Pandits, who were forced from their homes in 1990.
Imagine the fear, the heartbreak, the sense of loss they must have felt as they were uprooted from their ancestral lands.
Their story is a powerful reminder of the human cost of this conflict, and that's just one example.
And what about the young people? The ones who have grown up knowing nothing but violence and uncertainty.
Their childhood stolen, their dreams shattered by the constant threat of conflict.
I mean, how has that experience shaped their worldview, their hopes for the future?
And then there are the women of Kashmir,
often the unseen victims of conflict,
bearing the brunt of the violence and instability.
And their stories, too, need to be told.
Absolutely. These are just a few examples of the countless voices that need to be amplified. The personal narratives that can give us a deeper understanding of the human toll of this conflict.
Because if we want to truly understand Kashmir and work towards a just and lasting peace, we need to listen to these voices. We have to.
Their experiences, their perspectives, their hopes and dreams should inform our understanding of this complex issue.
Absolutely. Because ultimately, any solution to this conflict will need to address the needs and aspirations of the Kashmiri people themselves.
Imagine a peace process that prioritizes inclusivity and dialogue.
Okay, yeah.
A process that creates spaces for Kashmiris from all walks of life to share their stories and their visions for the future.
That would be amazing.
A process that recognizes the diversity of Kashmiri society and finds ways to bridge those divides.
It wouldn't be easy. I mean, decades of conflict have left deep scars, and rebuilding trust takes time and effort.
But it's the only way to achieve a truly sustainable peace.
A peace that's not imposed from the outside,
but that grows organically from within Kashmiri society itself.
We've explored a lot of ground in this deep dive into the Kashmir conflict. We've examined the historical context, the political dynamics, the sociological factors at play. We've discussed potential solutions and highlighted the importance of listening to the voices of the Kashmiri people.
But this is just the beginning of the conversation.
There's so much more to learn, so much more to understand.
And it's up to each of us to continue exploring this complex issue.
To seek out those untold stories, those unheard voices.
To challenge our own assumptions and biases.
And to work towards a future where peace and justice prevail in the beautiful and troubled land of Kashmir.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn more.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep seeking the truth.